Amy Dorman. Amy, if you would like to turn on your video, Amy will be the moderator for this event. She is a current PhD student at the University of Minnesota in social work and also a PhD research assistant at the Center for Integrative Leadership. And Amy is a Minnesota State Certified Sexual Assault Crisis Counselor, violence prevention educator, and violence prevention policy researcher and analyst, and she has conducted original research around violence prevention efforts in Ramsey County and Anoka County, and has led research projects for the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, the U.S. Human Rights Network, and the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Amy, thank you for moderating. I will let you take over and introduce our panelists today.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation this morning. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and as we gather in this virtual space, we recognize first and foremost the people who have lost their lives to domestic violence. The 2020 homicide report recently released by Violence Free Minnesota found that at least 30 people died in relation to domestic violence in Minnesota this past year. We know the pandemic has exacerbated incidents of domestic violence and that agencies, partnerships, and communities across the state rose to the challenge of addressing violence in these times. Minnesota is home to one of the first domestic violence shelters in the nation and continues to lead the way in domestic violence policy and practice. However, we must recognize that domestic violence is situated within the context of state violence, economic violence, and other forms of social violence, including racism, sexism, ableism, and trans and homophobia that the state continues to struggle with. We know that many people have been historically excluded from these conversations and from the crafting of policy solutions, and that a community-centered approach is essential going forward. Part of this approach is actively engaging and fostering collaborations between all three sectors, public, nonprofit, and private, to center community voices and to fully use all of our resources to prevent and end domestic violence so our communities can thrive. Throughout this conversation, I will be using the term domestic violence as this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but this term is often used interchangeably with intimate partner violence, dating violence, relationship violence, and interpersonal violence. So you may hear those terms from our panelists today, depending on what term they use most often in their work. Domestic violence includes physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, economic, and other forms of abuse by one person to exercise power and control over another person within the context of a household or intimate relationship. We recognize that this is a topic that may bring up trauma for folks, and we want to encourage everyone on the call to take the steps needed to take care of themselves during this conversation. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and have our panelists turn their videos on and join us in this call. As I introduce Sasha Cotton, who is the Director of the Office of Violence Prevention for the City of Minneapolis, and Justin Navratil, Health Program Planner and Policy Analyst for Anoka County Public Health, and lead organizer of the Anoka County Violence Prevention Roundtable. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Sasha, I'd like to go ahead and start with you if you would like to briefly introduce yourself and your background and share with us some of the cross-sector approaches or programs that you have either employed previously or are currently employing to prevent domestic violence in your community.
Good morning, and thanks, Amy, for that high-level overview and great introduction. I am Sasha Cotton, the Director of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention, and I've been working in violence prevention really most of my career. I started out early on in probation and juvenile services, and then spent a good amount of time working on trafficking and anti-trafficking work with young women and girls who are highly mobile or homeless, and left that work to actually go to what is now Live Free Minnesota, but was then Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, and spent over 5 years leading their prevention work, and then came to the U to work for the University of Minnesota and the School of Social Work as the research coordinator for the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, and finally found myself at home in the city of Minneapolis, starting out with youth violence prevention coordinator, and now the director of the newly formed office. We've just been in office for over 2 years. So our work portfolio has, expanded and shifted over the almost decade that I've been with the city. And we've really been grappling with how we incorporate domestic violence into our broader scope quite naturally. As someone who's worked in the field, I'm really passionate about the issue and see it showing up in so many places. Right now, our portfolio is largely focused on gun violence prevention and really looking at community impact and a lot of work affecting groups and gangs and their prevalence for engagement with violent activity. But we certainly see this intersectionality and have been working in a couple of areas strategically thinking about domestic and family violence. One of them being a core curriculum called Coaching Boys into Men that our office has been working on with the CDC through a CDC grant, where we're doing youth education with student athletes at the high schools in North Minneapolis, really leaning into the relationship dynamic that we know coaches and student athletes have, and the prevalence that we've seen for domestic assault and sexual assault in athletes, whether that be at the collegiate level or the professional level, and wanting to get out in front of that by teaching young men in particular these healthy relationship skills, how they can be interrupters of those gender norms and cultural norms that lead sometimes to intimate partner violence and sexual assault, and really be on the front lines of advocating amongst their peers how atrocious that behavior can be and how it can lead to really horrible outcomes later in life. And so we have been doing that work for over 5 years, and we'll be expanding hopefully to other high schools in Minneapolis' system soon. And we're also funding a number of programs to do culturally specific domestic violence work in Minneapolis, namely in the Southeast Asian community and in our East African community. So we're trying to touch a lot of places with limitations, but also looking at ways to really centralize domestic and intimate partner violence in our core programming. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share a little bit about our work and my history in the movement.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Sasha. You mentioned some things that are really important in terms of thinking about prevention through education, building relationships, and also thinking about how these different programs and prevention efforts can be culturally specific. Justin, I know that these are some things that you've grappled with as part of the Anoka County Violence Prevention Roundtable, so I'd like to pass it to you so you can briefly introduce yourself and some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So my background, I started as an EMT, and I was thinking of going through that route and possibly going to nursing or med school. And really, as an EMT, I really got to see a lot of things happening in the hospital and wanting to work more upstream. So that was my impetus to go back, and I actually went to the University of Minnesota School of Public Health and got my master's in public health administration and policy. Really interested in working upstream to prevent and promote health. So I've been working in local public health for the past 6 or so years, and currently at Anoka County Public Health and Environmental Services, where my role is really a facilitator of community involvement to identify our priorities and address those priorities through strategic planning. And you mentioned the Violence Prevention Roundtable. So I facilitate our community health needs assessment, which every community in Minnesota is required through the Minnesota Department of Health to go through this community health assessment and planning process and identify the top health priorities in your community. And in 2018 and 2019, our community, Anoka County, identified relationship violence, which is the term we use, as a top health priority for the community. And we do have a lot of great assets in the community that we have to draw upon for relationship violence. But one thing that we noticed was missing was a community-led effort integrating multiple sectors in assessing the strengths, the assets, and weaknesses, the opportunities that we have in addressing relationship violence from a prevention point of view and intervention as far as serving victims of relationship violence. So that Violence Prevention Roundtable has been operating for about 2 years now since that has occurred. And yeah, it's really critical. This is a huge issue, and it's really more than one issue. It's many issues coalescing together that is impossible to tackle or to make progress with any single entity. And as a public sector representative, we rely upon our community partners to provide that expertise. We rely upon the private sector to provide support and education and to get the word out. So it really is a multi-sector approach, and it does involve the entire community. And Just really quickly about the Violence Prevention Roundtable, it's open to anybody who's interested in joining, community members, or if you have if you represent an organization that in some way is interacting with relationship violence victims or is interested in preventing relationship violence, then members are encouraged to join. And I would not call myself a subject matter expert on almost any subject, but my role is really to help facilitate and to guide that effort. And that is really critical for these complex issues that we need organization, we need people, and usually more than one. It's a team effort just to organize and develop some priorities and strategies and work long-term to address those in that way. So that's where we're at right now, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Justin. You mentioned something that's really important, that it clearly is a team effort. We do believe that communities are such an important part of being able to move through these grand challenges, but we also know that it's challenging in and of itself to engage people in different sectors. We all have different languages within our networks that we utilize in our work. Everyone has competing schedules. So Sasha, I'd like to ask how you have really approached engaging other people from other sectors. You mentioned the Coaching Boys into Men program, engaging with school systems. What has that been like with you? What have been some of the challenges, and how have you been able to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, thanks. That is a really insightful question. I think, for us, and my personal approach has always been to really try to root this in the collective experience and how common domestic and sexual violence really are. I think it's definitely one of the forms of violence that we know comes with all of these narratives around shame and blame and guilt. And so there's not always clear good and bad guys, so to speak, in people's minds. And I think anchoring into the fact that exposure to violence influences, from a public health standpoint, a person's vulnerability to be a perpetrator or a victim of violence. And we know that when violence is happening in the home, it's deeply impacting children, and that can shape their life over, a very long period of time, well into adulthood. And so really trying to talk about it as a prevention method, and something that, we are firm believers in the Office of Violence Prevention that violence is preventable. It's not this inevitable thing that has to happen and just a part of the natural human experience. We know that it does happen, but that we can do something about it. And so I think trying to give folks some tools and language to talk about it, as you mentioned before, I think sometimes people get really stuck in like, how do we talk about this? How do we create a narrative that feels age appropriate and culturally appropriate, and reduce the discomfort that people have about it? Because it sometimes can feel like this taboo thing. And so I think for us, particularly thinking about the Coaching Boys into Men work, creating that across the high schools in North Minneapolis and leaning into that relationship with coaches was a really important strategy, because anyone who's played sports or been around student athletes knows that coaches hold a lot of respect and are able to really influence the opinions of the players that are playing for their team. And so having this like open dialogue. So what the model does is really provide what we call fast breaks. And so it's during a regular practice, they're pausing once a week to take on a topic matter and have some intentional dialogue about some aspect of domestic or sexual violence and healthy relationship development. And so these moments open the door for people to be vulnerable, to talk about their own lived experiences. And I think what we've seen over the years that we've been implementing is, in the beginning, sort of a fumbling from the coaches, feeling like this is a little bit awkward. And now that we've been doing it for 5 years, coaches really leaning in and seeing it as a way to enhance their relationships with their students, and a place where they can, every student's not a star athlete. Some students, they're on the team, but they're not necessarily the starting five on a basketball team. And this work also gives some of those students who are support players or want to participate on the team another way to shine, right? That they can really be leaders in this way as well. And so for us, we've seen providing spaces for people to own their leadership and to tap into lived experiences, whether it's firsthand experiences or secondary experiences, because we know that on a team of 15 players, the likelihood that some of them have been exposed in their homes or know people who have been impacted by domestic and sexual assault has happened. The statistics tell us that that is, a number of those young people have experiences. And so giving them a safe space to talk about it has been, I think, a really important piece, and for framing it as an asset, right? That like we're giving people space versus people needing a space and not having anywhere to go with it is also really important. So the numbers matter, I guess, is what my short answer should be.
Yes, thank you for all of that insight. One of the things that I'm hearing you talk about is the importance of building relationships and the importance of having people in safe spaces being able to have these conversations and how that can be more impactful. We also know in particular that involving men as allies in this work is absolutely essential given the very gendered component of domestic violence. And Justin, I know that at times it's been hard to engage men, it's been hard to engage the private sector in some of your work and your background. How have you approached that, and how are you considering continuing to approach that in the future?
Yes, it is always a challenge to get more variety and more input and discussion from a variety of perspectives. And as far as the private sector, we have made some inroads recently through our local area chambers of commerce, which back in 2020, we had done some work on putting together these focus groups for community leaders. And we specifically included local business leaders in these focus groups, local area chambers of commerce, because they know what the business community is like, and wanted to make that connection. And they did provide some very valuable input. Through those focus groups, those community leader focus groups, we also had representatives from attorneys, we had EMS, we had local city leaders, including mayors. So being part of the discussion as far as asking the questions and allowing that space to occur for people to share their perspectives is really important. So it's not just a one-way street. We're telling you everything you need to do or whatever. That's not going to get you very far. It needs to be asking, so what are you seeing in your community? What do you think is most impactful, and what are the specific issues that you're seeing? And then really acknowledging and respecting that information that's provided, and rolling that into future involvement. And we have been able to increase our membership among men in our violence prevention roundtable, and have some connections with our local businesses, like I said, through the local chambers of commerce, through our monthly newsletters, and through local television programming, even to provide a little bit of information about Domestic Violence Awareness Month, for example, and where people can go for resources if you're needing resources, or to talk with the roundtable if you have ideas about how to if you want to get more involved with this topic. So yes, engagement is always a challenge, but I think the key is to make it true engagement, is to have that respect for those that you're involving with, and really to bring their thoughts and perspectives on board, and folding into the work that maybe you've already done. So yeah, through the roundtable, we've spent a lot of time to really build a solid foundation of assessing the landscape in Anoka County. Where are our assets, and where are our opportunities for improvement? And that's an ongoing process that's never going to end, really. But I think it's really critical, especially in the beginning when you're starting a cross-sector partnership, is doing a kind of environmental scan of the current landscape. Relying on the data, as Sasha mentioned, we need to make sure that we're keeping the facts in mind. And we had a lot of good information come through our most recent assessment, including some troubling statistics from the Minnesota Student Survey showing that relationship violence is becoming more and more common in our younger people and at younger age groups. So, for example, our 8th grade students in Anoka County overall had seen a jump from about 8% to about 12% between 2016 and 2019, as far as experiencing some form of relationship violence. So just having, the facts in mind, and then getting that qualitative, that more nuanced information from community members and leaders, including those sectors that you may not think to involve at first or at the very beginning, but it is important to get that those perspectives. The more the merrier, basically. The more you involve, the better your product is going to be, the more information you're going to have to work with.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Justin. One of the things that I'm hearing is that this is often a very private topic. It's historically been considered being centered in the family. It's private. We don't talk about it, but both of you are coming from a public health perspective and thinking about how this can be engaged in community, how the entire community is impacted by it. So I'm curious in particular, Justin, in how you actually went about engaging the private sector and what opportunities ended up opening up because you found this gap, sought to fill it, and what was the response from people when you engaged with them, and what have been some of the opportunities afterwards?
Sure. So yes, and we did actually have a survey back, and so this would have been the fall of 2020, targeted on relationship violence, because we wanted to get some more information from community members. And some of the themes that came out of that were exactly as you mentioned, that this is kind of a hidden issue. It's a very important issue, but there's a lot of stigma involved, feelings of shame or negative feelings, whether it's felt by the individual or by others, with regards to relationship violence and the incidents of relationship violence. So getting that conversation going is one of the hardest parts of dealing with domestic violence, and raising awareness, involving those individuals in those sectors that maybe are not dealing with this on a daily basis, or maybe not have as much experience as others like us in the public health or in the nonprofit sector may have. So it was really important for us to follow up that survey with our community leader focus groups. And then from there, that opened up some doors to allow us to engage with the private sector, with our local businesses. And the newsletters, the TV spots that we've had leading up to Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I feel like have been really successful in getting the word out. And that's why October is so important, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This is the time to talk about something that is not easy to talk about and doesn't get the attention that it deserves throughout, all the entire year. So, it's I feel like the more we engage with those private sectors, the more that we'll be able to provide resources to local businesses, and the more information that they'll be able to provide to us. Again, it's a two-way street, that we need to have ears and eyes knowing what the community is feeling and what those needs are, but we also have some resources that we can provide out in the community through these channels, whether it's the private sector or our local schools or nonprofits, those type of places that can be really valuable avenues to provide information. So I hope that kind of answered the question. Let me know if I missed anything there, Amy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Obviously, a big part of prevention is getting the word out there. We know that businesses in particular often have these huge banks of newsletters. They have access to thousands upon thousands of employees, these TV spots that you've mentioned, local TV spots where people might be able to tune in and hear about domestic violence and what they can do and be able to engage the community that way. All very important. Sasha, I'd like to turn to you and ask how you have thought about engaging the private sector in your office and what that maybe looks like if you haven't done it yet, what you might consider in the future.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's certainly something that we've been exploring. Certainly when we're talking to some of our national partners and thinking about the level of Fortune 500 companies we have in Minnesota, and so just the overall investment in domestic violence from a sort of a thought partnership, because we do have so much happening around domestic violence in Minnesota. We have not really sought out the private sector just yet, and that's not for any particular reason other than that we've just been trying to get our feet underneath us as a relatively new office and sort of grappling with city dollars and federal dollars, but we certainly see their opportunities to think about, working with the private sector. I know when I was at the state coalition and also when I was with IDVAC, we were working very closely with Verizon Wireless on a number of engagement and sort of pub ed work, public awareness work that they were supporting, as well as the program that they have to get women experience, or victims, period, experiencing domestic violence, cell phone access and service. And so I think the private sector has a really important role to play. And I think so often this narrative, because we know public safety is anchored in, local government, right? That local government has a responsibility to keep people safe and to provide public safety resources that we sometimes negate to ask. And so what I know about the private sector is that if you don't ask, it won't happen. And so I think we've been thinking a lot about what our ask ought to be. And then also recognizing that sometimes these issues, like community violence, can get really nuanced. The work that we do around gun violence and sort of gang violence, it feels like it's really tailored to one demographic or a handful of demographics based on where people live or identity politics. But domestic violence is one of those things, while it can have disproportionality, it cuts across every community. And, so many people can relate and feel compelled to act. And so it is one of those areas that seems like a natural fit to be making a pitch for to the private sector. So Justin, I might be giving you a call to talk more about that at some point.
I love that. I see us all nodding our heads vigorously. Yes, the private sector has a role to play. Absolutely. And it's one of those things that can get very siloed, especially when we're just, we're a government organization. This is the money that we have. And so, Sasha, I'd really like to talk to you about how you've been able to expand and think about involving communities and making sure that your policies and your practices are culturally specific to communities. We know that particularly with things that are rooted in government, it also often can be very isolating to folks and more open to certain demographics than others. So how have you approached that in your work?
That's a great question. I think it is so important to be really intentional. I come to this work with an academic background in criminal justice, but also double majoring in ethnic studies. And so really always in my work, thinking about these intersections of how crime and violence show up and can look and manifest differently across different communities of color, of the global majority, and that it is beyond just ethnicity, but it really looks at socioeconomics and geography of where you live, rural versus urban, low income versus wealth, even right in an urban area. And so for us, it really has always been about a deep level of engagement and building relationships. We know that in a city like Minneapolis, where we have, close to 450,000 residents, and then obviously lots of people coming into the city, whether that be to work or school or for entertainment, we always say what people live, work, and play in Minneapolis. It's important for us to be trying to create those opportunities for people to talk to us. And obviously, COVID has presented itself with some real challenges around community engagement and doing sort of the typical things that we would do, like focus groups. And I see I have a little one that just appeared. I apologize. But we also are really thinking about how we can leverage the COVID pandemic and the use of technology for good. So what it's allowed us to do is really look at some of our national partners and some of the best and brightest across the country on some of the topics that we're working on, and to pull them in and create opportunities virtually for our communities to tap into what we've been calling learning labs and learn about our work and different topics and areas of interest that people have that, oftentimes if someone's in town visiting us to provide technical assistance or training, they can maybe, touch 20 people or 50 people, but online we can open that forum up so much wider. And so we've really been trying to do that in an intentional way.
That's great. Thank you. I think one of the things we're really thinking about, all of us in the pandemic, is how to kind of connect with people, how to engage in leadership virtually. And like you mentioned, Sasha, that can be a very positive thing. It can also be very challenging. So I'd like to transition to talking about how, as leaders of these organizations, you've thought about leadership in these positions and these efforts, and how you have approached some of the challenges in being able to engage people in these conversations, particularly thinking about those differences. So I know Justin and Anoka County is very diverse in terms of you have some more rural areas, you have some more urban areas. How are you engaging folks in this work, particularly thinking about the pandemic?
Yeah, so we do have quite a variety. We've got more urban panhandle down in the Columbia Heights, Fridley area, and then it's quite rural up north in the St. Francis, East Bethel area, and trying to, get a wide variety of membership in our violence prevention roundtable is really important. So reaching out to organizations, municipalities, and law enforcement and other professionals around the county just to try to get that variety engaged, and knowing that this is not an issue that just affects one particular area or city or community, but affects all. And that's part of the reason why, as the roundtable, I mentioned this is open to all, and we really want this to be a collaborative effort. We want to have representation from multiple perspectives. We want to have diverse racial and ethnic, religion. We want to have diversity in LGBTQ status, disability status. The more diversity, the better. The more perspectives we'll have to bring to the table and be able to confront the barriers that we're seeing and do some more work upstream to preventing relationship violence and making sure our residents are prepared and have what they need to be healthy, and that includes preventing relationship violence and having what they need in order to avoid and prevent that. So I think it's really important too that we have some very strong leaders in our group. We have a county commissioner that is very involved and very passionate about this issue and topic, and that has been really important for us to get that buy-in. We also have a very, very vocal and very involved group in Alexandra House, which is a nonprofit organization serving victims of domestic violence and working hard on prevention of domestic violence as well. So that group's involvement has been very important as well. And yeah, engagement is always on top of the mind, and all of our plans, all of our strategies that we're putting into place is with the mindset that we want to do as much good as possible to the greatest number of people, basically. And we are actually currently doing some more work to identify those barriers that are experienced within the county with regards to relationship violence services, in particular intervention services, but also prevention, because there are quite a lot of various perspectives on the issue of domestic violence, and there are cultural considerations as well, and language barriers and things like that. So the more we can get around those barriers, the better. So that's been our approach right now to engagement. And yes, it does really involve the entire community, and that includes geography as well as sector involvement and representation from diverse racial, ethnic, cultural perspectives.
Thank you, Justin. One of the things that I'm picking up on this conversation and a way that you introduced yourself is that you consider yourself a facilitator of the roundtable. You don't consider yourself the lead or the head. It's been a very collective approach is what I'm hearing. You mentioned some other leaders who are part of the table. What does it look like to approach domestic violence prevention from this collective leadership approach? How have you approached it? Why have you approached it that way? And what does that look like in practice for you?
Sure. So yeah, I like the idea of servant leadership, and I try to integrate that into all of my work, which isn't just relationship violence, but includes a variety of other topics, including the COVID-19 pandemic and many other topics that are identified as health priorities. But really, we're here as public health to provide some expertise, yes, but also to allow good work to happen. And I think that is really critical, because the silos do exist in the community, and those siloed approaches prevent meaningful progress from happening. So I see my role, and more generally the role of public health, as developing bridges between those silos and bringing those organizations together to come up with really what the community wants, what the community needs as far as health promotion and health improvement. So yes, I do take a leadership role, but yeah, basically I don't want to get in the way of anybody. I want to help facilitate those discussions and the work, the good work. I want to be able to facilitate the good work so it can happen. And you know, that's I think a key piece of our role in this is bringing together people at the table that have a lot of knowledge and experience and can contribute to the conversation and helping to make that happen. So so yes, it is a kind of a, you know, a different sort of take on leadership. Maybe it's not my way or the highway, and I think it's kind of nice when you're not an expert in some ways to be a little bit distant and to not have all the answers. One thing I've heard in the past is, you know, and I can't remember the context exactly, but a good facilitator doesn't have the answers. A good facilitator has the questions. So being able to ask the right questions and to bring people to the table to answer those questions is really a key piece of cross-sector leadership and for complex issues such as this one.
Speaking of questions, I want to remind everyone that we do have the Q&A function that's available to you. So if you do have any questions, please throw them in there. We'll save some time at the end to make sure that Sasha and Justin can answer those questions for you all. Sasha, I'd like to ask you a similar question. How have you approached leadership in this work?
Now, the slogan of the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention, which I should say is in our health department. So we are anchored in a public health approach to addressing violence prevention in all of its various layers. But our slogan is Minneapolis. It takes all of us to prevent violence. And so we really are trying to lift up this ideology that there's a role for everybody as we think about how we prevent violence. And that certainly is inclusive of domestic violence. And so for me, it really is about creating communities of practice and trying to identify ways that even not just your average neighbor can really feel like they are connected to a role. And people want to be a part of something. You know, it's very hard, particularly I think for us as an institution of government, that often it can feel like this imposing, like top-down strategy. And so our work has really been about trying to create tables and opportunities, even as we think about our funding, you know, to do sort of this collaborative funding opportunities and to develop partnerships. And I think one of the ways that we've done that is through shared learning. So we've been doing a project called the Blueprint Approved Institute. The Blueprint is our strategic plan on violence prevention. And it's an older plan and we're in the process of updating it. But the Blueprint Approved Institute is a fellowship, and it really is designed to help those people and individuals and organizations that are really small, often culturally specific, or people who have been impacted directly but want to give back, you know, like the woman who's a survivor that wants to serve others now that she is on a path to health and wellness in her own journey, or folks who have been previously incarcerated for gun and gang violence who want to use that lived experience to help others not make those same choices and mistakes, but they don't have the hard skills. You know, they've got the passion and often the reach, right? They know how to reach the people who they're trying to target, but giving them the infrastructure can be really hard. And so the Blueprint Approved Institute is designed to do just that. So we do micro grants to those organizations, but it's also a fellowship opportunity for them to get about $50,000 worth of training. So it's free training on how to develop a board, how to get set up as a 501c3 if that's what they want, how to lean into evidence-based practice and use research. And then they demonstrate, you know, come up with like a project scope for a small program area that they do some demonstration work with. And then we do some evaluation support work for them on the background. And so I think creating those opportunities for people to test what they think works and what they believe in is really important. We think about our work as both replication of evidence-based practice and research, because that's so important, right? We've got to invest in the things that we know work, but we also know that Minneapolis residents are innovative and they know what they need. And sometimes that doesn't line up with what the evidence has shown can work, because it takes so long to get, that stamp as an evidence-based practice, and so much money. And so often our communities of color and low-income communities don't have those relationships to leverage. So the other bucket of our work is our capacity building and innovation work. And that is really where a lot of our domestic and sexual violence work is happening, and where we're able to fund and help programs grow and build. Because what we know is that if violence prevention is going to be an industry that lasts a long time, we have to build the coalition of the folks that can do the work. And so for us, it has been about, having worked for the coalition for many years, I am always thinking about how do we build a movement? How do we build coalition amongst providers so people don't feel alone? Because this can be really lonely work too. So I think those have been some of our really most important strategies. And then also thinking about cultural and geographic specificity, recognizing that Minneapolis is a big place and it's a really diverse place. And that's what makes it such a beautiful place to live and work. But it also can present challenges if you don't look at it as an opportunity. And so really leaning into how do we bridge cultural divides, how do we create culturally specific opportunities, but also bring people together. And so we've just tried to be really thoughtful about how we can go about being leaders on that topic.
So much wealth of knowledge there, Sasha. Thank you so much. We did have a quick question. Could you just repeat the blueprint? Is it Blueprint for Proof, the grant organization?
Sorry.
And how?
The program is the Blueprint Approved.
Approved.
Sorry, I've got a toddler here that wants to join the party. The Blueprint Approved Institute, and I can share the link to that. The application for that program will actually go live in December. So if there are folks who are interested in participating in that in 2022, we can make sure that we get you guys connected to where that will post so that folks can check it out at their leisure once it's open.
Great, thank you. I would like to ask you both, because I know that we have several students and faculty members on the call. Oftentimes academia can be in its own silo. We kind of live in our own world. They call it an ivory tower for a reason. But I'd like to hear both of your opinions on how students and faculty members, staff at the university, how they can get plugged into your work. So Justin, why don't I start with you?
Certainly. Well, if you're interested in our specific work in Anoka County, you can certainly reach out to me and we can talk, and you can learn more about the Violence Prevention Roundtable. And we're always open to having members join that are interested in this topic and have passion for preventing relationship violence. Also, I would say that, this is your opportunity if you're a student to really study and dig into some of this subject as much as you can, and to learn what are those nuances, those evidence-based practices that we mentioned, some of the trends or the epidemiology of relationship violence and what's being done. I often go back to the Healthy People 2030, or they have a 10-year timeline for a wide range of health issues, and domestic violence is one of them. So looking at the Healthy People 2030 goals is a good resource for that kind of national level. Violence Free Minnesota, as Amy, you mentioned, they recently released the 2020 homicide report. So that's a great resource for getting more acquainted with this subject and some of the factors that are involved with these domestic violence deaths. And they also released some recommendations for communities and actors in the area to implement as far as how to prevent and intervene with relationship violence. So those recommendations are really helpful for our work as well. We kept those in mind, as well as the CDC's reports on interpersonal violence and prevention. So yeah, I mean, getting involved as much as you can. I would say also try to shadow and get internships if you can in the area, if this is something you're interested in, and try to, as you mentioned, really the key is bridging between those silos. And although the background information is is critical, and that's very important to this work, and don't want to discount that. But I think really getting involved and getting nose to nose with those that are involved with this work, and those that know from a practical standpoint how to implement prevention practices and resources, as well as those serving victims, just having conversations with those professionals and those community advocates can be really, really helpful for getting involved. So yeah, it's got to be, it's kind of the two sides of the coin. You got to know your stuff, but also get involved and have that practical experience and exposure as well.
That's a great takeaway. Thank you, Justin. Sasha, I'd really like to hear your input in terms of what you see as the role of academia and how students and faculty and staff at the university can get involved in the work.
Yeah, we've done some work with the University of Minnesota recently around looking at, the relationship between officers and young men of color, and are always really open to partnership with the University of Minnesota because we are touching so many different, facets of violence prevention in our office. I think the traditional routes of internships and volunteering is so important. We have in our office, the volunteer opportunities and internships can be limited because we're an institution of government. We're working in so many different lanes. But we've got, 80 to 100 organizations that we're working with at any given time, either through funding or network or whatever. And many of them would greatly benefit from an additional set of hands. So volunteer opportunities, I think, are really important. I think the other thing is that we're looking at our community moral voice group for our group violence intervention strategy, and some of the work groups that we focus on are really community driven. How do we get that community voice on a consistent basis? So for people who are really wanting to get in the weeds, feel free to reach out to our office and we can talk about some of those opportunities. But the other piece that I always say is showing up is so important, whether it's virtually like these spaces or in person where there's an event. I think when we talk about violence prevention, people can get a little bit gun shy and think that like such an oxymoron, right? That I'm inserting that term, but people can get a little nervous about showing up to things. And it's so important that we have voices and diversity of people who are showing up, not just because they're impacted, but because they care about the issue and they don't want to see more people impacted. So I think that's a really important piece. I think the other piece of it is doing the work to know a little bit, to be able to engage in the conversation from a perspective, because so often these topics come up and it's just sort of like domestic violence is wrong, but you're unable to really articulate how deeply it's impacting community, how it's hurting people beyond just the immediate victim, how it has long-lasting systemic impact, and how there are real systems of improvement, right? That like we can work to make people safer when we work together. And so I think, doing the work to educate and inform yourself so that you can be an advocate in conversation with your friends and families and community of faith, right? That's how we get pervasive messaging out there. I mean, yes, PSAs and public ed are really important, but people take information from people they trust. And so if you can be a source of knowledge for the people in your network, that's going to make a huge difference and doesn't cost you anything. I would also say violence prevention is not really a clear career trajectory, right? None of us went to school per se to do violence prevention. We have this wide breadth of background and experience. And so if it's something that you're interested in, I would say take a look at the kinds of jobs and the kinds of background that some of the folks here and in other spaces have, because I think the world is opening up, whether it be domestic violence or other forms of violence, and professionalizing the field. And so there are going to be real opportunities. And I think it's important that we have students who are coming behind us who are ready to fill these shoes, and others that are going to become available in the years to come.
Thank you so much for sharing that. In our last couple of minutes here, I would like to ask about some of your recommendations for people who are on the call as they think about approaching cross-sector work in their work. Sasha, you mentioned you've got 80 some organizations you're in touch with on a regular basis as an office. That's a huge pool of people. Justin, I know that you're very well connected in the work that you do as well. What are some of the top recommendations that you would have for folks, even if it's outside of domestic violence, for engaging across sectors and kind of keeping the momentum going in the work that you do? Justin, you can go ahead and start.
Sure. So pretty much everything we work on as far as health promotion and health improvement planning is cross-sector from our perspective, with a lot of expertise from internally within our department. But I would definitely recommend finding those leaders and those organizations that are doing a lot of good work in that area. Like, for example, we work really closely with our local hospital system, which is Mercy Hospital, and they have a lot of programming for a wide variety of health issues from a prevention point of view. And I think the healthcare sector in general is moving more toward that. Prevention is really critical to communities, rather than the traditional, treating patients in a hospital or a clinic setting or whatever, but really finding value in preventing health issues from occurring. So finding those leaders in the community can be really valuable. Reaching out to your local public health department for these things, but this is not certainly just limited to public health, quote unquote, issues. There are many issues and topics that could benefit from engagement and collaboration across sectors. So I guess, doing some brainstorming about what are those sectors, what are those organizations that are most involved, and reaching out to them just to see, is there something like this happening already in the community? And if not, why not? And if not, what can we do to develop something like that? How can we develop some shared buy-in, some shared, approach to having some benefit to this collaborative work? So getting that in place is also really key, like having a direction, having a shared vision for the future, whether it's a world without relationship violence or something else that you're passionate about. That it's definitely takes a team, it takes a community to get there.
Thank you. That makes so much sense. One of the things that I'm hearing is that asset mapping that you've been talking about. What's actually happening in the community? How do we build off of it as opposed to replicating? That's so important. Sasha, what are some of the tools and strategies you have used to engage across sectors?
Yeah, I think that asset mapping is such an important part of it because this work is not always super clear. And in public health, we're thinking about, primary prevention, so stopping the violence before it ever happens. Secondary, really intervening as early as possible and trying to work from that early onset. And then tertiary, which is like, the repeat ongoing cycles of violence that we're trying to interrupt. It's not always obvious. I think people think about like the very specific violence prevention staff or programs. But for me, the public health approach is not about exclusion or saying like, it's just the schools or it's just this program. It really is about inclusion. And I think when we talk about the public health approach, people can often get really confused and feel like, oh, it's, in our arena, it's public health or it's public safety. But really the public safety work, particularly when we think about law enforcement, and probation and parole, all of that is included in a public health approach because the public health approach is working across so many spectrums. So it's like, yes, if we think about COVID, we want to do everything we can to mitigate someone from catching it. We don't want the virus, so to speak, to be caught in the first place. We want people to wash their hands. We want them to wear masks because that can protect you from ever getting the virus. So when we think about violence, it's like exposure is the same way. We want to limit the number of people who are being exposed to violence in their home and in their community and even through media because it can stop the spread. But we also have to treat people if they're sick. And so if people are sick with the virus of violence, we have to have the best systems in place to treat them, which means we have to have relationships with law enforcement and probation and corrections because people are going into those systems theoretically for treatment. And if they don't get better, they come back to our communities more virally infected and more contagious. And so for us, it really is about building as many relationships as we can and helping people to see that we think they have a role across all of it. And it's not about excluding anybody, but how do we build stronger relationships and bridges to serve the people so that people can live a violent-free lifestyle.
So important and really rooted in that public health, community-based approach, understanding that everybody really has a role to play in prevention and really changing the culture around violence and the tolerance that our communities often have towards violence. In our last couple of minutes here, I would like to just hear how folks can get involved in the work that you're doing. We've talked a little bit about internships, volunteer things. I know Domestic Violence Awareness Month, sometimes there are very specific things that a community might be doing. So Justin, I'll start with you if there's specific ways that folks can get plugged in.
Well, you can email me and I can help you get started there. I would certainly recommend also if you want to volunteer, Alexandra House is a great place to get in touch with local leaders. But you can, I can put my email in the chat or whatever, and you can reach out to me. There's Purple Thursday coming up. There's Purple Lights campaign and things like that. A lot of that has already kind of happened with October, getting geared up for October, but there's a lot of ways to get involved and a lot going on.
Sasha, what about on your end?
Yeah, for us, I would say the same. You can certainly email me. I can put it in the chat or someone can put it in the chat to share with the group. But also, starting on Monday, we're going to start posting some domestic violence awareness information on our Facebook page. And so following us on Facebook is a great way to plug into our work overall. And we're really planning to highlight Domestic Violence Awareness Month in the latter half of October. And so, that's definitely one way to stay engaged and learn a little bit more about some of the programs we're partnered with who are focused on intimate partner violence.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I did put both of your emails in the chat. So folks who are interested, please reach out to both Sasha and Justin. I know that we're right at our time, so I want to thank you both so much for being a part of this discussion, and to everyone who was able to join us. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to obviously reach out to Sasha or Justin, or reach out to us at the center as well, and we'll be able to make connections there too. I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.